So the Cold War came to an end in 1989, and it came to an end swiftly, surprisingly, unexpectedly. In other words, it came to an end peacefully. There was a lot of rejoicing over this fact, and ever since there's been a lot of myth-making about the end of the Cold War. So what I want to do is take a few minutes now to explain why the Cold War ended and to examine a couple of the theories as to why the Cold War ended. The first is that Reagan bankrupted the Soviet Union, that he stared down Mikhail Gorbachev and the other leaders of the Kremlin and forced them to back down and end the Cold War. And that's simply not true. By 1989, the Soviet economy was in really bad shape, there's no question about it, but it certainly wasn't bankrupt. And as we've seen from regimes around the world over the last century, you don't need to be wealthy in order to wield military power. And Mikhail Gorbachev certainly had the military wherewithal to have responded militarily to the fall of the Berlin Wall, to prevent it, and to stop the movement of thousands of people across Eastern Europe who were heading to the frontier with Austria and with West Germany to flee Eastern Europe into Western Europe. The Soviets had more than enough military power to stop that if they wanted to. In 1956 and 1968, Soviet leaders faced the exact same dilemma that Gorbachev did in 1989 as people were fleeing Eastern Europe and as they were calling for reform. And what they did in 1956 and 1968, as well as in the early 1980s in Poland, was to crack down, and to crack down hard. Gorbachev had a decision. He had a choice to make, and he chose not to crack down. Now, a lot of that had to do with US foreign policy and Ronald Reagan and diplomacy, but it had nothing to do with the fact that the Soviet Union was supposedly bankrupt, because the Soviets weren't bankrupt and they still had that military power. This argument that Ronald Reagan ended the Cold War through his demonstration of strength, and that by escalating the Cold War and then launching SDI, he sort of cowed the Soviets into submission, completely skews our perspective of the end of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan does deserve a lot of credit for the end of the Cold War. There's no doubt about that, but it's not because he stared down the Soviets. It's because he was willing to work with the Soviets and negotiate with them in an open and friendly and constructive way. And he did this against the advice of a lot of his own advisors, especially Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and others in the Pentagon who didn't trust Gorbachev and who thought it was that Gorbachev's liberalizing reformist program was a trick to lull Americans into complacency, and then the Soviets would strike back. Reagan didn't listen to them. He worked with his Secretary of State, George Shultz, instead to forge a new diplomatic relationship with the Kremlin. And for that, Reagan should go down as a peacemaker. And he does deserve a lot of credit. But none of that was possible without Mikhail Gorbachev. And so Gorbachev, of course, deserves a huge amount of credit for the peaceful end of the Cold War. As I said, he had a choice, and he chose not to crack down. Instead, he chose a more difficult road and ended in his own political failure and removal from Russian politics in the 1990s. Still, it was a choice, and he made a choice that led to the peaceful end of the Cold War. Now, the argument that I've been making through this lecture is that neither Reagan nor Gorbachev could have succeeded in ending the Cold War without the other. And it's easy to imagine that if they hadn't worked together, that the Cold War would have continued into the 1990s and indeed into the 21st century, just as it has with North Korea and with Cuba and with other countries that didn't have the Soviet Union's resources at its disposal. Both figures deserve to be called peacemakers, and both of their governments deserve credit for embracing this new relationship and trying to find a constructive way out of Cold War tensions. Still, there is something to be said for the pressures that the Soviet Union faced by the late 1980s. The United States went through its time of trial, its crisis of hegemony in the 1960s and 70s through a series of domestic crises, urban crises, racial crises, as well, and economic crises, as well as foreign policy crises. And the United States, of course, fought and lost the Vietnam War, which was not only a huge political travesty, but it also came with an enormous economic cost, as well as real damage to American credibility. And yet, by the early 1980s, the US was back on the front foot. The Soviets went through a very similar time of testing in the 1970s and especially through the 1980s, with the war in Afghanistan, with the Soviet economy really creaking and not able to provide for basic goods for its citizens. And in the mid-1980s, global oil prices collapsed, which removed the main source of foreign income to the Kremlin. So the Soviet economy was in really bad shape. And it was at this time when Western economies were in the midst of a really profound transition, one that we live in today, towards computers, towards deregulation, towards technological innovation, towards the information revolution, and eventually towards things like the internet and globalization, that the Soviet economy was just not well fitted to adapt to. The Soviet economy was based on heavy industry. It was really a late 19th, early 20th century economy, and that was fine well into the 20th century. But by the 1970s and 1980s, that just was no longer doing the trick. And there wasn't enough slack economically for the Soviets to pick up through a time of crisis and then to recover. This doesn't mean that Reagan bankrupted the Soviets, but it does mean that the Soviet economy was incredibly frail. Gorbachev recognized this, and he recognized that it needed to reform if it not only wanted to provide a certain basic level of prosperity for its people, but also to take advantage of the new technological innovations that were completely transforming Western economies. And here we can see these changes happening in the United States through the story of three valleys in California. The first is the Napa Valley, where the California wine industry is based, and which experienced a real boom in the 1970s and 80s and into the 1990s with international prestige and billions of dollars flowing in terms of wine sales, but also the tourism industry. The second valley is the San Fernando Valley, which is where a lot of the Hollywood studios are based. And what also emerged in the 1970s and 1980s was the adult film industry, which became extremely popular and brought in billions and billions of dollars into the San Fernando Valley near Los Angeles. And the third, and by far the most important valley, was Silicon Valley, just outside San Francisco, in and around Palo Alto and Stanford University. And that's where the information revolution was born. Now, what those three valleys in California represent is technological innovation, economic innovation of a kind that had nothing to do with heavy industry, and that really epitomized through tourism, through consumer culture, through computers and information technology, really epitomized the way in which Western economies would define themselves with the United States at the lead. Now, this had ramifications across society, including for military technology, but also for pretty much every way that people lived. And that wasn't happening in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, and it looked like it wasn't possible for that to happen in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Now, Gorbachev recognized that. Ronald Reagan also recognized that. And that kind of profound shift in how human society actually functioned that was already underway in the West and wasn't going to happen. It wasn't happening and wasn't going to happen in the Soviet Union, caused a real rethink in Washington, but especially in Moscow. In other words, the United States had the wherewithal and it had the ability to adapt to overcome a crisis of Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s in ways that the Soviet Union simply could not. Essentially, the Cold War ended because Mikhail Gorbachev placed a bet that he lost. He bet that he could reform Soviet society enough so that it could recover from its economic crisis, it could recover from the war in Afghanistan, and he could relaunch the Soviet Union in a slightly modified form for the modern world. That's a bet that he placed, and it explains why he didn't intervene in Eastern Europe as client regimes started to come under pressure and as the Berlin Wall was coming down. It's a bet that he lost. And he was as surprised as anyone else at how the Cold War turned out and that by 1991, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist.